Herkese merhaba Gazete Duvar izleyicileri. Hepiniz Gazete Duvar'ın YouTube kanalına hoş geldiniz. Bugün çok değerli bir konuğumuz var. Hindistanlı tarihçi Vijay Prashad bizlerle birlikte. Bugün Suriye gündemini değerlendireceğiz kendisiyle. Lafı fazla uzatmadan dilerseniz sözü kendisine verelim. So, thank you so much for accepting us once again.
Please, my pleasure to be with you.
So maybe we can start briefly about recently what happened in Syria, recent developments, events that happening in Syria. I mean, everything happened so fast. I mean, some weeks ago, if you tell people, hey, in some days, Jolani will be the new ruler of Damascus, probably no one would take this seriously. So, but here we are, the country's future now in the hands of an old ISIS chief. In the other hand, we also see that different actors such as United States, Turkey, or Israel are in the ground in Syrian lands for their own interests. And all these rapid developments reminds us maybe, I don't know, the famous quote by Lenin, which was there are decades where nothing happens and there are weeks when decades happen. Okay, maybe he said this inside of a very different circumstances, but still the speed of the events reminds us this maybe. So generally, how do you see what is happening in Syria?
Well, the first thing to recognize is that Syria, for the last 15 years, has really not been able to exercise its sovereignty. In the northeastern part of Syria and parts of the east in general, the United States has captured a large part of territory. The United States holds whatever remains of Syria's oil fields, and the United States has sanctioned Syria quite severely over this decade. Then, in the northern part along the Turkish border, various Kurdish groups, not just one, but various Kurdish groups have, taken a number of cities and towns. They have also exercised what they consider their autonomy from Damascus. Then, when we come to the northwestern part of Syria, and you can see we're just playing with Syria like it's a puzzle. You just take bits out. In the northwest of Syria, since 2014 at least, the city of Idlib has been in the hands of various Islamist groups. When the Syrian army has tried to advance upon Idlib, Turkey invaded Syria in 2020 to prevent that and then made an agreement with the Russians to defend Idlib. So the northwestern part was largely under Turkish dominion. Then, if you come to the south, as a consequence of the weakened Syrian army, the Syrian government made deals with all kinds of forces in towns that include large cities like Daraa. It looked like it was peaceful, but in fact, they had made peace agreements and withdrawn forces from large parts of these cities. Finally, in Syria's west, Israel had already taken the Golan Heights in 1973 and was exercising pretty strong claims upon the border areas of Syria. There was a new military division, Division 210, created by the Israeli military to basically be prepared to seize as much territory as possible. When we talk about Israel, over the last year, during its genocidal war against the Palestinians, Israel has been bombing and weakening the Syrian army, bombing Iranian logistical, warehouses in Syria and so on. By the time, the Hayat al-Tahrir decided to move from Idlib down south, the Syrian army was totally weakened. Russia was occupied in Ukraine, and the Hezbollah forces were not capable of crossing the border to defend Damascus. And I must say, Mr. Assad also played a very poor game. He didn't allow Hezbollah to fire rockets at the advancing troops. And when he left, he didn't even make a speech to his people. He just left quietly. Some of his people, I'm told, drove off to Iraq. They abandoned Syria. And so the collapse of the House of Assad, 53 years of Assad's governing Syria, happened, as you said, very quickly. But in fact, it had been happening over the course of the last decade, a slow and cautious attrition that eventually collapsed. Let's just say it directly. The HTS led by Abu Musad al-Jolani received air support from Israel and ground support from Turkey. This is not a revolution. This is the overthrow of the Assad government already weakened by Israel and is a major victory for Israel.
Mhm. And also, another disturbing scene of the past days was, I think, the media coverage about the events, because we saw that most of the Western media representatives, together with some others, I mean, started to whitewash Jolani, and they literally tried to show his ISIS and Al Qaeda background as an acceptable youth mistake. And they portrayed him as a transformed, pragmatic, moderate, and even charismatic leader. And we saw plenty examples like that. Some of them were more hidden, some of them were more obvious. For example, we saw what CNN did, like a parody style of news. But there were also some other people. They made similar news, but willingly and without any state affiliates. So uh, at the end of the day, all of them they try to build this legitimacy in our minds about these new rulers of Syria. So that's why I would like to ask you: do you think they are ignoring the past of these people just because they believe they really believe for a bright future for Syria, or would you say it's an Orientalist mentality, thinking that according to them, that kind of a government fits to an Arab country, or they just don't care, maybe? So, what are your ideas, your views about this coverage?
Well, firstly, Mr. Jolani is interesting. Jolani is a name he took in a matter of war. It refers to the Golan Heights. It's ironic because Mr. Jolani's government, or whatever there is now in Damascus, is not contesting Israel's seizure of the Golan Heights, Israel's seizure of the buffer zone. None of that is being contested. I mean, he has the name Jolani, but doesn't seem at all inspired to seize Syrian land back from the Israeli occupation off the table. Mr. Jolani gave an interview to CNN, and I would actually ask people to go and watch it. It's an interesting interview. Somehow, in the last couple of years, Mr. Jolani has been very well trained because when he was a young man, he went to Iraq. He joined the worst of Al Qaeda in Iraq, the kind of groupings associated with Mr. al-Zarqawi, who was the Jordanian man who conducted horrible acts of violence against the Shia population in Iraq. Mr. Jolani himself was one of the people sent by al-Qaeda in Iraq to form Jabhat al-Nusra, the support front for the uprisings in Syria in 2011. Mr. Jolani led Jabhat al-Nusra until he decided to separate from Al Qaeda, at least nominally, in 2016, at the time creating a different formation and so on. But there's no evidence that until the CNN interview, there's no evidence that Mr. Jolani had transformed his thinking. You know, over the course of the last few years, he gave more interviews to Israeli academics and Israeli media than to other media. I mean, if you go and look at Israeli academic and policy, establishments, there's a lot of policy people who went to see him in Idlib and interviewed him. It's very interesting. You know, it's not been remarked upon very much, but there it is. So Jolani has transformed himself. He says that what happened in Iraq and in Syria was about his youth, and now he's more mature. In fact, he's wearing a sort of khaki, olive green uniform, no longer the sort of shabby clothes of Jabhat al-Nusra. In fact, many of his ministers have taken off the headgear, taken off the clothes, put on suits, and now call themselves Democrats. Look, for the sake of the Syrian people, I very much hope that they're telling the truth when they say they don't want to go and kill minorities. On the other hand, there are already significant coverage coming out of people being targeted. So I don't want to be one to say, well, these guys are actually Al Qaeda underneath those suits provided to them, most likely by the Americans, the Israelis, or the Turkish government. This is not the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood that was sitting in Istanbul, ready to come to power in Damascus. These are real Al Qaeda fellows. Maybe he has changed his mind. People do. I very much hope so. I doubt it. I doubt it because it's not been that long. And, there are many, many forces. I mean, in the advanced battalions that drove down Highway M5 were Al Qaeda type figures from Urumqi, Uyghur, peoples that are in various Uyghur forces that are in the what's it called, Turkmenistan Islamic Party, I think, tip. These forces are not going to be democratic. They come with their own agenda. So again, I very much hope what Mr. Jolani says is true, but I really, really doubt it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, as we mentioned in the previous question, now we see that many people focus on underlining how bad was the Assad period, but they don't say that much about how bad can be the future and the doubts about the future. So, okay, the bad guy is gone, but who come instead? So, isn't this story very much like what happened in Libya in some sorts, which actually we can even maybe look at the Libyan example in a more naive way. We can consider that the past of these people are more clear in this example, I guess. So they collected a terrifying CV since the beginning of the civil war, which you also mentioned it briefly about Jolani's case. So things are more foreseeable than Libya, maybe in this sense. But in summary, what do you think? What kind of a future that awaiting Syria?
Again, look, let's first say that in the Libyan case, there are some distinguishing features. One is that it is true that the ground forces that were fighting Mr. Gaddafi also had a predictable history. They were, many of them, members of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. Many of them had trained in Afghanistan. At least the emirs had trained in Afghanistan. Many of them came out of the Syrian fight and were brought to Libya, from Syria to be the ground forces for people like Mahmoud Jibril, who was the former financier of the wife of the then Emir of Qatar. These were the high class Libyans who arrived in Benghazi, but they were not going to go running to the battlefield. They brought the old Libyan Islamic Fighting Group forces. And there then came the chaos because these forces turned on the liberals and started assassinating them. And Libya continues to be in chaos. I mean, Syria was already in chaos. That's the point, the difference. As I described it, Syria was already balkanized. This organization in power now isn't going to balkanize Syria. Syria was already balkanized. They have come to power in Damascus. They will control perhaps from Idlib, Aleppo down to Damascus, that sort of spinal cord of Syria. But so much else is already controlled and contested by other people. I don't even know if they'll be able to hold Idlib. I'm sure that there are Turkish ambitions to come deeper and into Syria. That was already established. There are historical sites that Turkey continues to claim within what had been Syrian territory. So the balkanization has already happened. These guys are already pretty wretched. The one difference is that they seem to be in power in Damascus. It's only been a few days. They only came to power less than a week ago. So we can't tell. It took them 11, 12 days to go from Idlib to Damascus. We're not even 11, 12 days since they took power. Very hard to forecast. Things may stabilize between Aleppo and Damascus. I'm not sure there's been much contest. The Russians are not interested. The Iranians already said we were the last ones fighting and then we left. Mr. Assad has left. He still hasn't made a real public statement. He just says, I'm retiring from politics. I mean, there is no contest. Till the very end, whatever you think of Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein, till the very end, they stood up with pride and said, we are Arab leaders. Mr. Saddam Hussein, just before he was hung, told the judge, who are you to hang me? I'm Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq. Just before they killed him, Gaddafi said, you are dogs and you are the sons of dogs. I am Muammar al-Gaddafi. Mr. Assad just slipped out. Now, maybe Hafiz al-Assad would have behaved differently. Children who are given these jobs and responsibilities reluctantly don't always have the history behind them. He was a reluctant successor to his father. It's one other good example of why you should never have your children succeed you unless they are, themselves committed and have experience. I don't know if Libya is going to end up being a good parallel for Syria, but it certainly appears to be a very good comparison right now.
Mhm. And beside of the future that awaits Syria, I also want to ask a question about the future of the region, because, for example, now we see that Israel not only occupied the Syrian territories, but they also start to make some operations against military, civilian, or scientific complexes inside of the country. Uh, and they did this after the retreat of the Syrian army, actually. In the other hand, as you mentioned, Turkish-backed groups, they attack some Kurdish-controlled areas, and many reports of inner clashes and some type of executions start to appear slowly coming, maybe. And beside of the military presence, now Iran's route to Mediterranean Sea looks like it's blocked. And this type of events, of course, creates a huge echo in its regions, especially this fall of Assad. Some analysts thinks that it's one of the most important, most significant uh, events that happened in last years. So, my last question is that, so what you can say about the possible changes in the region that we can see?
Well, I'll tell you, and I'm being very honest here. Until recently, I felt that Israel was in a very weak position because global public opinion had turned against Israel for its genocide. Even though Israel was pummeling Lebanon, had managed to assassinate Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, I assumed that that Hezbollah would be able to recover one way or the other with Iranian assistance, but also its own resilience and contact in the ground, and that Israel would face a reckoning in some way. But I think really very cleverly, by providing air support to the rebels in Idlib, Israel has changed the balance of forces. The knocking out of Mr. Assad's government means, as you said, the land bridge that Iran had to go through Iraq, to go through Syria, and resupply Hezbollah and perhaps even Hamas. That will no longer be possible. Iran will not be able to send ships, to the Eastern Mediterranean. The United States has basically blockaded that whole territory. The whole of its fleet seems to be sitting. One of its fleets seem to be sitting off the coast of Israel. Very difficult for Iran to get ships to Lebanon. I think that's almost going to be impossible. The ships will be attacked by the Israelis. So I think Iran's position, which had been strengthened after the United States knocked out Saddam Hussein in 2003, Iran's position now is greatly weakened. It has to return to its borders. The fact that Iran has not been able to properly retaliate for assassinations and bombings done by Israel in Iran is suggestive of its weakness. Secondly, I think Russia is going to be a little bit weakened in this because you see, Russia had a role in Syria, but the Syrian airfields provided Russia with a refueling point for Russian planes then to go to Africa, carry supplies to its allies in Africa. Now it's going to be difficult to resupply some of its allies on the African continent. The airfields in Syria are gone. Who else is going to allow Russian military aircraft to land on territory? Nobody in the Middle East right now. That's going to pose a significant challenge. Perhaps Russia will try to land in Yemen. I doubt that that's going to be possible. This is a kind of a withdrawal of Russia to some extent from its Middle East ally, principal ally. This is going to have catastrophic impact for the Palestinians because now in Lebanon, Hezbollah is weakened. In Syria, there is effectively a pro-Israeli government. In Jordan, there's a pro-Israeli government, signed a peace agreement 1994. In Egypt, there's a pro-Israeli government, signed a peace agreement in 1979. Not one of Israel's borders is any longer threatened by an adversary, not one of its borders. Now, obviously, Syria and Israel had an understanding. People are making a lot of it now. All neighboring countries do. But Syria was still a threat to Israel. It allowed Hezbollah to be resupplied. That itself was an enormous historical task. So Israel is greatly strengthened in this, and the Palestinians are going to find it hard to regroup. It was to the advantage of many of the Arab countries that Hezbollah be weakened. They didn't like Hezbollah for various reasons, some of them sectarian, but not only. It was also the politics of Hezbollah. So I feel like we are in for a difficult period in the Middle East. When it comes to Turkey, this is interesting. What is this going to mean for Turkey? During the Arab Spring, Mr. Erdogan had put forward a kind of neo-Ottomanist foreign policy. There was a belief in Ankara that Turkey would be able to have deep, sort of deep positions in Syria if the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood had come in Tunisia. The Muslim Brotherhood come in. Egypt, Muslim Brotherhood had when Mr. Morsi, the president. In Libya, you had Muslim Brotherhood contesting power. These were all allies of Mr. Erdogan's Muslim Brotherhood organization. So it looked that there was, a neo-Ottoman possibility in 2011, 2012. Well, now with an no, I wouldn't say Mr. Jolani is an ally of Turkey, but he is grateful to Turkey. Turkey has a new opportunity. What will happen? Will Turkey try to take charge of the Palestinian resistance? The Palestinian resistance had been shaped by money from the Gulf Arab states, principally Qatar and others. It had been shaped by Iraq, by Syria, by those alliances and allegiances. Now, will Turkey try to have a role there? I don't know. Turkey has a close relationship to Israel. What does all this mean? It's going to take us some time to unravel the million contradictions. But I want to underline two things. One, it's not great for the Palestinians at all. This is a setback, an enormous setback. And secondly, I think this is an enormous setback for Iran. But we shall see. History doesn't end so easily.
Okay. So is there something else that you would like to add?
Well, I mean, I would just like to say that nobody could have expected the timing, as you quite rightly said. It was very quick. But it was clear to Iranian military and intelligence officials who were warning Mr. Assad in the weeks before this that things were looking ugly. And in fact, when Mr. Assad met the Iranian foreign minister said the fall of Aleppo is terrible. Mr. Assad said, no, it's a tactical retreat. I mean, he was living in a world of illusions. The Iranians were warning him right through. They knew it was coming. It's important to recognize. Maybe you and I were surprised, but the Iranians knew it was coming, and Mr. Assad's government didn't listen to them.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time and joining us.
Yes, thanks a lot. Great to be with you.